Enrollment students, today I'm going to be in the auditorium, but I will come in to check your chapter 11 reading notes from last class and from last night's reading. Additionally, I make sure that you do your Cornell notes for all of chapter 11, including your summary, because I will be checking those and putting them in the grade book as well. Your chapter 9 and 10 recovery points for the quiz is on Google Classroom and it is due next week, so please check that out and make sure you get it in because I will not accept it late. So let's get started on today's lecture on the second half of chapter 11. We stopped at the bank controversy right after we talked about the Jacksonian Indian policy. So at the beginning in the 1830s and right before the 1832 election, the National Bank was going to run out of their charter in 1836. So there were some opponents to the bank being rechartered. So the South and West had a monopoly, felt that there was a monopoly on the bank where a small group was manipulating for the interest of the North. So they thought it was more for the North than it is for the South or the West. The West was also unhappy about the National Bank because of after the Panic of 1819. So what happened after that, there was a decrease in paper from state and local banks. And because of this, the debtors from that panic ended up suffering because of the decrease in paper. They didn't have enough money in paper that was backed by specie, so it hurt them, as well as businessmen and speculators were basically taking advantage of those who weren't being financially stable because of the Panic of 1819. So, because of the rechartering needed to be done by 1836, the president of the National Bank was Nicholas Biddle, and he really wanted to make it a central election issue because at this time, there was a majority in Congress who would have voted in favor of the bank. On the other hand, if Jackson didn't support it and vetoed it, there was a chance that it would change the majority that was in Congress. So in 1832, both houses actually passed the rechartering of the bank. However, Jackson vetoed the rechartering in 1832. And the election of 1832 is significant because it brings in a third party. This is the first time we've had a third party brought in, and it's also historical because it had a third party, which was the Anti-Masonic Party, and it doesn't really matter what they stood for, but it was just important that they were a third party. This is the first time a party held national nominating conventions. This was something that we're used to having today. The parties at the time were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. They still were not holding national nominating conventions. So the third party, the Anti-Masonic Party, did this, and they also announced a platform. So this is brand new. So after this election, we see this coming up between the two major parties. So they adopted what the Anti-Masonic Party did during the election of 1832. So the election, Jackson won overwhelmingly. So right after the election, he went ahead and responded to the rechartering attempts by Nicholas Biddle. He decided to remove all the government deposits from the National Bank because it was his way in order to wage war on the bank because he didn't like the bank. So he changed secretaries of the Treasury. McLean was fired because he disagreed that to take all the money out of the National Bank. However, Taney was a new treasurer and he was okay with it, and he helped Jackson put all this money into what they called pet banks, and these pet banks were state banks, and the state banks were kind of not regulated and also didn't have normal operations. So they did things like um, um, they tended to do things like curtail loans, redeem state banks into species as soon as possible. So they kept on redeeming things. Um, so all of this was brought to a halt, which ended up, if you are curtailing loans as well as redeeming the state banknotes and species is hard currency like gold and silver. What ends up happening is you cause a sharp depression, and it was also intended to reveal how important the national bank was. So the reaction to all of this is that there was now a contraction of credit. So people weren't able to get loans, and if you can't get a loan, then that means you can't put money into the economy. So it brings more into a depression era. It also started people doing more speculation, where they would take more risk because of this. It also increased land sales was a part of this, as well as states becoming more and more indebted. So even though they're trying to keep the national bank afloat, what ends up happening is that the national bank and the state banks ends up bursting. And they try to help it along first, trying not to have that happen. And they do this fiscally through a couple of measures. So they do the Distribution Act, which is it would eliminate federal surplus to loan excess to states. So any federal surplus would then be loaned to states to help them. It also had what we called the species circular. And again, species is always the hard currency like gold and silver. So you could only sell public land, and people could only buy it with the gold and silver. So only species. What this ends up doing is it adds strain to the already limited supplies of gold and silver. And then we also have a problem with international compliance, in which species from British, French, and Mexico and payments to them will be in species. However, what ends up happening is that there's a decrease in British investments because of this. And what ends up happening is actually the financial panic of 1837, and this is after the charter of the bank has expired, as well as the end of the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So what happens in 1837 is that banks suspend all species and money on their banknotes, so nobody can get any money, although there is a run on the banks. So, and we'll get to more about the Panic of 1837 in a little bit, and how the government reacted to it. So we're now seeing a new party system come up. Before we had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans are now the Democrats. And we have a new party come up called the Whigs. So the Whigs they support the National Republican Party, and they're also kind of remnants of the anti-Masonic and Democratic parties, is what they're from. Their philosophy is social conservatism, economic nationalism, construction and internal improvements by the federal government, the national bank, as well as high tariffs. In the election of 1836, the Democrats nominate, and this is their first nominating convention. As I said prior, in 1832 is the third party who first started this. They nominate Van Buren, and then the Whigs actually had multiple candidates. So the Massachusetts legislature nominated Webster. The anti-Jackson Tennessee legislation nominated Hugh Lawson White, and the anti-Masonics from 1832 was the third party before. They actually nominated William Henry Harrison. So Van Buren is called the little magician because he's very skilled in organization as well as in manipulation and making people feel like that they are doing better than what they truly are. He makes people feel like things are better than they are. So he responds to the Panic of 1837. There were Van Buren says government should not intervene. It should be something that's done by the states themselves. There was a special congressional session that was held in 1837, and it stated that it would postpone surplus distribution indefinitely. So there would be no distributions to the state banks indefinitely, and it would approve issue of actual treasury notes, which is paper money that we see from federal government now. The causes of the Panic of 1837 is there was a depression in England, which decreased the amount of American cotton that was being invested in. And so there was an American commitment to it and loan extensions in America so it was more like over speculation where you got more loans in order to create more cotton, and what ended up happening is that England couldn't buy it. You were left with loans. Another thing is that in 1836 the wheat crop failed, which again the risk outweighed the loans, so they were left with the loans without anything to pay for it. The effect of the Panic of 1837 is that employment actually went up to a third of the country, which is pretty high. The wages were cut to 30 to 50% across the board, and the food and clothing prices now went up, and which makes perfect sense because if you think about it, if most people are not being able to grow food, buy food, as well as clothing and agricultural products, it's going to be going up because there isn't as many there. So what Van Buren decides to do, instead of rechartering a second bank, he decides to create an independent treasury, which is what we still have today. So the Independent Treasury Act was passed in 1840. It was repealed in 1841, but then reinstated in 1846. And it was basically making sure that there was no risk of federal funds in any either shaky state banks or the possibility of rechartering or not rechartering the bank. The federal government would have their own vaults, and all business would be handled in hard money only. So only species, the gold and silver, would be only the business money of the federal government. So we come up to the election of 1840. It's called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider Campaign. The Whigs nominated Harrison. He was considered the log cabin. He didn't really have any platform. He was just basically distracting from the issues. It was mostly about his personal qualities and wasn't really anything set. The Democrats, they nominated Van Buren, and really what they wanted to see is more of a change, and that's the reason why William Henry Harrison won pretty much in the electoral votes. It was a landslide where he received 234 of the electoral votes while Van Buren only received 60. So when we're looking at the Jacksonian years, there were some good things that happened from Jackson's years. One of the things that we see is that voter participation increased. So we do see that the common man was being heard during this time period, as well they were more likely to vote. And also there were different conflict interpretations. So the Whigs didn't like the spoils system. The progressives at the time, they say that the Democratic movement, the farmers, the laborers, National Bank, they all want that to go goodbye. as well as the revisionist interpretations of it, is that Jacksonian democracy was really all about white males. So these are all different interpretations about the Jacksonian era. Some think he did well, some think he didn't do as well, but he did contribute to the overall participation in voting. And so that is the end of chapter 11. We will begin chapter 12 next week, and we will have a test on chapters 9 through 12, not next week, but the following week. And I'll get the test out to you probably next week. Please email me with any questions that you have. I will be in the building. And again, I will come up and check your chapter 11 notes from last class and this class. Other than that, you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you next week.